The porcelain teacup shattered against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silence of the dining room. But what deafened me wasn't the crash of breaking china, it was the suffocating weight of the announcement that had just sucked the oxygen out of my lungs. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, sat across from me with a radiant, almost predatory smile plastered on her face, her hand resting protectively over a stomach that was barely showing, while I felt the blood drain from my face until my hands went numb. She had just told me she was pregnant again, for the 4th time, and expected my joy, my tears of happiness, and my immediate submission to another 3 years of servitude. I looked at my son, David, who was staring at his plate like a man awaiting a verdict, and then back at Jessica, and for the first time in 68 years, the dam holding back a reservoir of resentment finally broke. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry, but something vital and accommodating inside of me simply snapped, severing the cord that had tethered me to their demands for nearly a decade. This wasn't a blessing. It was a sentence, and I was the prisoner who had just decided to dig a tunnel out. I am Eleanor Vance, a 68-year-old retired librarian living in the rainy gray embrace of Seattle, Washington, and for the last 6 years, I have not been a grandmother, nor a mother, nor a retiree enjoying her golden years. I have been an indentured servant, a ghost in my own life, raising 3 children who call me Nana but interact with me as if I am a piece of automated furniture. Their biological mother, Jessica, has lived the life of a carefree 20-something socialite, treating motherhood like a hobby she picks up on weekends for photo opportunities, while I have been the one wiping noses, changing diapers, soothing fevers at 3 in the morning, and draining my life savings to keep her facade afloat. When she announced baby number 4, the room didn't fill with the warmth of new life. It filled with the cold, hard reality that I was about to die in this harness if I didn't cut it off right then and there. The nightmare began innocently enough, as these things always do, slipping into my life with the stealth of a rising tide. 6 years ago, when my first grandson, Leo, was born, Jessica was only 24, a young woman who seemed overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of caring for a newborn. I remember sitting in their cramped apartment in Capitol Hill, watching her struggle to latch the baby, seeing the tears of frustration welling in her eyes, and my maternal instinct overrode all logic. I told her I would help, that it was normal to be scared, that I would be there for a few weeks until she found her footing. I thought I was being a good mother-in-law, the kind of village elder that young families need in a fragmented society. I didn't realize I was signing a contract in invisible ink that would strip me of my autonomy. Those first few weeks turned into months with terrifying speed. It started with simple requests, like asking if I could watch Leo while she ran to the grocery store or had a quick dental appointment. I was retired, after all, and I loved my grandson, so I agreed without hesitation. But the grocery runs became 3-hour absences, and the dental appointments morphed into full afternoons where she would return smelling of expensive perfume and white wine. By the time Leo was 6 months old, I was arriving at their house at 7 in the morning and leaving well after dark, while David worked himself into an early grave at a logistics firm trying to support a lifestyle Jessica demanded but refused to contribute to. When the second child, a spirited girl named Maya, arrived barely 2 years later, the trap snapped shut completely. There was no discussion, no request for help, just an assumption that Eleanor would handle it. Jessica would drop the children off at my quiet, well-ordered home in the suburbs at dawn, her car engine idling as she rushed the kids to my porch, shouting that she had things to do. Those things never involved employment or education. They involved brunch with friends, shopping trips to Bellevue, and hours spent curating a social media presence that portrayed her as a supermom. I would see the photos later, scrolling through my phone while the children finally slept, seeing Jessica posing with a pristine stroller she rarely pushed, captioned with hashtags about the exhaustion of motherhood. I was the one exhausted, my knees aching from crawling on the floor, my back spasming from lifting toddlers, my retirement dreams of travel and painting dissolving into a haze of formula and Baby Shark on repeat. The financial toll was just as devastating as the physical one. My pension, which I had carefully calculated to sustain a modest but comfortable life, began to hemorrhage. Jessica never sent diapers, never sent food, never sent clothes. If I asked, she would sigh dramatically, rolling her eyes as if I were a greedy landlord asking for rent, and say she forgot her wallet or that David hadn't transferred the money yet. I started buying the formula myself because I couldn't bear to hear the baby cry from hunger. Then it was the diapers, then the clothes, because they arrived in things that were too small or inappropriate for the weather. Then came the doctor's visits, the antibiotics for ear infections, the developmental toys. I sat down one rainy Tuesday, 3 years into this arrangement, and wept over my bank ledger. I had burned through nearly $30,000. By the time the third child, a boy named Sam, was born 2 years ago, that number had climbed to over $50,000. I was stripping the copper wire out of my own future to keep the lights on in theirs. My social life had evaporated completely. My friends from the library, a tight-knit group of women who traveled to vineyards and book festivals, eventually stopped inviting me. I had canceled on them too many times. "I can't. I have the kids," became my mantra, a gravestone epitaph for my personal life. I couldn't go to my own doctor appointments without dragging a caravan of strollers and diaper bags. I couldn't take a nap. I couldn't read a book. I was a prisoner in a nursery, and the warden was a woman who visited occasionally to take photos and complained that the children weren't dressed cutely enough. So, sitting at that dining table, staring at Jessica's triumphant smile as she announced the fourth pregnancy, the cumulative weight of 6 years of exploitation crashed down on me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a struggling young mother, but a parasite who had fed on my kindness until I was a husk. She was glowing, rested, her hair perfectly styled, her nails manicured luxuries I hadn't afforded myself in years. "You're not excited, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice taking on that sharp, dangerous edge she used when she sensed resistance. "The kids are going to be so happy to have another sibling. We are so blessed." I placed my napkin on the table, the motion slow and deliberate. The silence in the room stretched thin, vibrating with tension. "Jessica," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, calm and detached. "I am not going to watch this baby. I cannot do it anymore." The smile slid off her face like oil off water. She blinked, looking at David, then back at me. "What do you mean? You're the grandmother. Who else is going to do it?" "I don't know," I replied, standing up. My legs felt shaky, but my resolve was iron. "That is a question for the parents of the children. I have raised your children for 6 years. I have spent my savings. I have ruined my health. I am done." "But you love them," she sputtered, playing her favorite card immediately. "How can you say that? A grandmother who loves her grandchildren does anything for them." "Love is not slavery, Jessica," I said, picking up my purse. "And I have loved them enough to sacrifice 6 years of my life. Now, I need to love myself enough to survive the years I have left." I walked out of that house without looking back, ignoring David's stammered protests and Jessica's rising voice. I drove home through the rain, my heart pounding in my chest, terrifyingly aware that I had just declared war. The retaliation was swift and brutal. The next morning, at 7 sharp, Jessica's SUV pulled into my driveway. I watched from the living room window, a cup of coffee in my hand, as she unloaded the 3 children. They looked tired and confused. She marched them to the door and rang the doorbell. Once, twice. Then she began to pound on the wood. "Eleanor, open the door! I have an appointment!" she screamed. I stood there, hidden by the curtains, my heart breaking as I saw Leo, my sweet 6-year-old, press his face against the glass. "Nana?" he called out. "Nana, let us in!" Every instinct in my body screamed at me to open the door, to scoop them up, to feed them breakfast. But I knew that if I opened that door, even a crack, I would never close it again. I would be confirming that my boundaries were permeable, that my no meant maybe. So I went to the back of the house, put on noise-canceling headphones, and sat in my garden chair, weeping silently while the pounding continued for 20 minutes. Finally, I heard the car door slam and the engine roar away. That afternoon, the digital siege began. My phone flooded with messages from David. "Mom, what is wrong with you? Jessica is hysterical. She missed her appointment. She says you've had a mental break." Then came the photos. Jessica sent pictures of the children crying, with captions like, They don't understand why Nana hates them now. It was a cruel, visceral manipulation, weaponizing the children's confusion to twist the knife in my heart, but I held firm. For 3 days, I didn't answer the door. I didn't answer the texts. I simply existed in my quiet house, feeling the phantom limb sensation of not having a baby on my hip. On the 4th day, the escalation reached a new level of insanity. I was sitting in my kitchen, eating a solitary lunch, when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the rhythmic pounding of Jessica, it was a sharp, authoritative rap. I opened the door to find 2 uniformed police officers standing on my porch, with Jessica standing behind them, arms crossed, looking vindicated. "Ma'am, we received a call about a welfare check and potential child neglect," the older officer said, his hand resting near his belt. "This woman claims you are the primary caregiver for her children and have abandoned them, placing them in danger." The breath left my body. She had called the police. She had actually involved law enforcement because I refused to be her nanny. "Officer," I said, drawing myself up to my full height of 5 feet 4 inches. "These are not my children. They are her children. They live in her house. I am the grandmother. I have no legal custody and no legal obligation. I simply resigned from being an unpaid babysitter." The officer looked at Jessica, then back at me. He seemed to assess the clean house, my calm demeanor, and Jessica's frantic energy. "Is this true, ma'am?" he asked Jessica. "Do the children live with you?" "Well, yes," Jessica stammered, her face flushing red. "But she has always watched them. She can't just stop. It's neglect." "It's not neglect for a grandmother to refuse babysitting duties, ma'am," the officer said, his tone shifting from concern to annoyance. "This is a civil matter, a family dispute. Do not call 911 for this again." They left. But the damage was done. My neighbors, people I had lived beside for 20 years, were watching from their porches. I saw the whispers. I felt the judgment. Jessica stood on my lawn for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing into slits. "You think this is over, Eleanor?" she hissed. "I'm going to make you wish you had just opened the door. You'll never see these kids again." The war had moved from skirmishes to a scorched earth campaign. Over the next 2 weeks, Jessica launched a smear campaign that was breathtaking in its scope. She contacted every relative we had, spinning a tale of my descent into senility and cruelty. My sister-in-law called me from Florida, demanding to know why I had abandoned those poor babies. My niece sent me a long email about the importance of family duty. Jessica posted vague but damning status updates on social media about toxic elders and narcissistic grandparents, garnering sympathy from her army of online friends who knew nothing of the reality. But the lowest blow came when she showed up at the local library where I still volunteered 2 days a week. She marched in with all 3 children, who looked unkempt and miserable, and caused a scene in the quiet reading room. She wept loudly, claiming she was destitute and that I was hoarding money meant for the children. The head librarian, a friend of mine, had to ask her to leave, but the humiliation burned my skin. I went home that day trembling with rage, feeling cornered and alone. That evening, as I sat in the dark, contemplating giving in just to make the pain stop, my doorbell rang again. I flinched, expecting the police or Jessica. Instead, it was Margaret, my neighbor 3 doors down. Margaret was a no-nonsense woman with short gray hair and a history of union organizing. "I saw the cops," Margaret said, holding out a casserole dish. "And I saw that little witch screaming on your lawn. I think you need a drink and a lawyer, in that order." Margaret came in, poured us both a glass of wine, and listened as I poured out 6 years of secrets. I told her about the money, the exhaustion, the manipulation. When I finished, she didn't judge me. She nodded. "You're not alone, Elle," she said. "There's a group of us. We meet on Thursdays. We call it the No More Nanny Club, though we tell our kids it's a book club. You need to come. And you need to talk to my nephew, Joe. He's a family law attorney who specializes in elder financial abuse." "Abuse?" I recoiled at the word. "It's not abuse. It's just family." "It is abuse," Margaret said firmly. "Financial exploitation and emotional blackmail. Just because she's family doesn't mean she isn't a predator. You need to protect yourself." Meeting Joe was the turning point. He was a sharp, empathetic man who listened to my story with growing concern. When I told him about the threats Jessica had made regarding grandparents' rights and suing me for support, he actually laughed. "Eleanor, that's baseless," Joe explained. "In Washington state, grandparents have no obligation to provide childcare or financial support unless they are legal guardians. You are a free citizen. However, her harassment is real. We need to document everything. Every text, every dollar you spent, every threat." Empowered by Joe and the support of Margaret's group, women who had walked this same fire, I began to fight back. I went to the bank and requested 6 years of statements. The task was grueling. I sat with a highlighter, marking every transaction that was for the children. Diapers, formula, clothes, pediatrician copays, toys, strollers. The final tally made me nauseous. $54,600, money that was meant for my long-term care, for emergencies, for a trip to Italy I had promised myself, gone. I bought a digital recorder and kept it in my pocket. I installed a Ring camera on my front door. I was building a fortress of evidence. But the universe has a way of revealing truths when you start looking for them. 3 weeks into this Cold War, David came to my house late one night. He looked haggard, having lost weight. The reality of raising 3 children and dealing with a pregnant wife without my help was crushing him. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, standing in the rain. I let him in. He sat on my sofa, head in his hands. "I don't know what to do. Jessica is. She's out of control. She's spending money we don't have on conveniences because she refuses to cook or clean. We're drowning. I am sorry, David," I said gently but firmly. "But you are the parents. You need to figure this out." "There's something else," he said, his voice trembling. "I was looking for some tax documents in her home office, the one she keeps locked. She left the key on the dresser." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "I found a bank statement, an account in her name only." I took the paper. It was a statement from a high-yield savings account. The balance at the bottom made the room spin. $82,000. "She has $80,000, I whispered. "She's been saving it for 6 years, David said, tears streaming down his face. "She calls it her exit fund. All those times she told you we were broke, that we couldn't afford diapers, that she needed you to pay for the doctor. She was hoarding money. She was watching you drain your pension while she got rich." The rage that filled me then was cold and clarifying. It wasn't just exploitation. It was theft. It was a calculated, long-term con. "And there's more," David choked out. "The gifts you bought, the high-end strollers, the designer baby clothes. She didn't lose them. She sold them. On Facebook Marketplace. She's been flipping your generosity for profit." I looked at my son, seeing the realization of his wife's true nature shattering him. "David," I said, "I am going to sue her, and you are going to help me." We formulated a plan. The family was gathering for David's 35th birthday at my sister-in-law Sharon's house in 2 weeks. It was the annual mandatory attendance event. Jessica would be there, undoubtedly playing the victim, trying to turn the extended family against me once and for all. It was the perfect stage. The day of the party, the air was thick with humidity and tension. I arrived early, flanked by Margaret for moral support. My sister-in-law Sharon greeted me with a stiff hug. "I hope you're not going to cause a scene, Eleanor. Jessica is very fragile right now." "I'm just here to celebrate my son," I said, my hand clutching the heavy tote bag on my shoulder. The party began, and Jessica was in rare form. She sat on a lawn chair like a queen on a throne, her baby bump displayed prominently, accepting sympathy from aunts and cousins. She spoke loudly enough for me to hear. "It's just so hard doing it all alone. I pray for Eleanor every day. I hope she finds peace from whatever mental struggle she's having." I waited until the cake had been cut, until everyone was gathered on the patio, holding paper plates and plastic forks. I walked to the center of the patio, David standing silently by the sliding glass door. "Family," I said, my voice projecting with the authority of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding silence in libraries. "Before we finish today, there are some things that need to be cleared up." Jessica has been telling you all that I abandoned my grandchildren and that I am suffering from mental decline. Oh, Eleanor, please, Jessica sighed, rolling her eyes. Don't embarrass yourself. I have brought some reading material for everyone, I continued, ignoring her. I pulled a stack of folders from my tote bag. These are copies of my bank statements from the last 6 years, highlighted to show the $54,000 I spent raising Jessica's children because she claimed they were destitute. I passed the folders to Sharon, to my brother Robert, to my nieces. The rustling of paper filled the silence. And, I said, turning to look directly at Jessica, whose smug expression was beginning to falter. These are copies of a bank statement for an account solely in Jessica's name, containing $82,000. Money she accumulated while begging me to pay for formula. A gasp went through the crowd. Sharon looked up from the papers, her face pale. Jessica, is this true? That's private, Jessica shrieked, struggling to stand up. You stole that. That's illegal. It proves you're a liar and a thief, I said calmly. You watched me spend my retirement savings while you sat on a fortune. You sold the clothes I bought the children online. I have the screenshots here too. I held up another folder. The family turned on her. It was palpable. The sympathy evaporated, replaced by disgust. My brother Robert, a man who rarely spoke, looked at the papers and shook his head. This is evil, Jessica. Cornered, exposed, and losing control, Jessica played her final, desperate card. She clutched her stomach and let out a wail that sounded more like a siren than a human cry. My baby! Oh God, the stress! You're killing my baby! She collapsed onto the patio furniture, panting, writhing in feigned agony. Call 911. I'm in labor. It's too early. Panic rippled through the guests. Sharon dropped the papers and rushed to her. Oh my God, call an ambulance! I stood still. I watched her face. I had raised her children. I knew her sick face, her tired face, and her lying face. Her color was good. Her breathing was rhythmic between the screams. She's faking it, I said loudly. Eleanor, how can you be so cruel? Sharon yelled. She's pregnant. Uncle Robert, who was a retired cardiologist, stepped forward. Let me check her vitals. Everyone back up. Jessica tried to wave him away. No, just take me to the hospital. Get me away from her. Jessica, if you are in distress, I need to check your pulse, Robert insisted. He grabbed her wrist. He held it for 15 seconds while she moaned and thrashed. He checked her pupils. He placed a hand on her stomach. He stood up, his face grim. Her pulse is 70. Normal. Her skin is cool and dry. She's not in labor, and she's not in distress. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Jessica stopped moaning instantly, realizing the jig was up. She sat up, adjusting her dress, looking around at the circle of hostile faces. I felt a cramp, she muttered. You faked a medical emergency to avoid accountability, David said, stepping away from the wall. His voice was broken but clear. You are done, Jessica. We are done. David, you can't believe her over me, she pleaded, reaching for him. I believe the math, David said, pointing to the papers. I believe the hidden account, and I believe my own eyes. You've used my mother, you've used me, and you've used our kids as pawns. Get in the car. I'm taking you to your parents' house. Jessica left that party a pariah. The fallout was messy, painful, and necessary. David filed for divorce the following week. With Joe's help, we filed a civil suit for financial restitution. Faced with the mountain of evidence and the threat of criminal charges for fraud and elder abuse, Jessica settled. She agreed to pay back the $54,000 from her secret hoard, plus legal fees. The divorce revealed even more cracks in her facade. Without me to do the work, and without David to enable her, she crumbled. She ended up moving into a small apartment, forced to actually raise her children during her custody weeks. 6 months later, the landscape of my life is unrecognizable. I have my mornings back. I drink my coffee in silence, watching the rain wash the world clean. I have rejoined my book club. I have booked a trip to Tuscany for the fall. But the most important change is my relationship with my family. David and the children come over on Sundays. Just Sundays. I cook a meal. We play games. I read to them. And when the sun goes down, they go home. Last Sunday, Leo sat on my lap, tracing the veins in my hand. "Nana, are you happy now?" he asked. I hugged him, smelling the shampoo in his hair, shampoo his father bought. "Yes, Leo," I said. "I am very happy. I learned a hard lesson in the twilight of my life. I learned that martyrdom is not love. I learned that family is not a magic word that excuses abuse. True love requires boundaries. It requires respect. By saying no to my daughter-in-law, I saved my finances, yes, but I also saved my dignity. I taught my grandchildren that it is okay to stand up for yourself, even against the people you love. I am no longer a servant. I am a grandmother, and for the first time in a long time, that is enough.